Thursday, July 4th. It is rather late, but I think I'll put down the day's events before I go to bed. This entry hasn't anything to do with private enterprise, and simply about Independence Day. Since some of my class in Nepal hasn't been back in the United States for several years, I wanted to tell them about the 4th of July and how it's celebrated. They may have a lot of wrong ideas, just as I had. All my life, I've listened to my mother and father tell me about how they celebrated the 4th. They shot off firecrackers, threw torpedoes, shot Roman candles, set off pinwheels and skyrockets, and stepped on red devils that cracked and popped. They made a racket all day long, burned their fingers, ate until they were sick, and had a wonderful noisy time. No more. There aren't any firecrackers. They're against the law in most states, and New Jersey is one of them. Now you go sit in a big football stadium and watch someone else set off pinwheels and skyrockets. All the kids do now is fidget around on the hard cement seats and wait for the boom. Of course, having the fireworks shot off for you is better than not having any at all. Uncle Al says that outlawing fireworks was a good thing because every year a number of people, usually children, got badly burned. Some were maimed for life and some were killed. Of course, now that we've made the glorious 4th safe for banning fireworks, he said, people take to the highways in droves and kill each other with their automobiles. I suppose I should take you down to the shore today, but frankly I'm afraid to. I wouldn't drive anywhere for all the tea in China. Aunt Mabel suggested that we go in for the fireworks at Palmer Stadium later, and Uncle Al agreed. Since we can get to the Princeton by the back roads, he was willing to drive that far. Naturally, I was disappointed about not having the kind of 4th my parents had told me about, but there was no use feeling sad about it. I decided to spend the day as I would a quiet Sunday, so I got a book and started to read. I was on the couch on the front porch, and Uncle Al was puttering around some bushes beside the porch, with a blue and white sedan exactly like Uncle Al's drove into the lane. Uncle Al looked around in annoyance and muttered something about visitors. "It's Mr. Apple," I said in a low voice, "and he has a car exactly like yours." "I know he has," Uncle Al said. "It doesn't make me like my car any better. However, I think he got his first, so I shouldn't kick." Mr. Apple got out of his car and marched across the lawn like a small boy on his way to speak a piece in the Sunday school. "Mr. Harris, I'm sorry, but I have a complaint to make," he said. He didn't look a bit sorry. "Yes, what's that?" "That hound of your nephew's insists on coming over on my property and causing damage." "What kind of damage?" Uncle Al asked, straightening up with a grunt. "Well, he digs," Mr. Apple said, "right in the center of my lawn." Uncle Al looked at me with a question in his eyes. I nodded. "I saw him digging there once," I admitted. "I didn't know he had any other times." "He is constantly running across my property," Mr. Apple said. "My wife has a cat, and he frightens that. I don't think it's a bit too much to ask that he be kept on a leash." "Keeping a dog on a leash out here in what is practically country is pretty tough on a dog," Uncle Al said. "Suppose I have Hank keep a closer eye on him. Then if he continues to bother you, I guess we'll have to tie him up." "I'm not interested in promises," Mr. Apple said. Agony is a smart dog, and I always will think he heard what was being said, and knew that he had to do something if he wanted to keep his liberty. He must have been hiding around the corner. Also, Siegfried gave him wonderful cooperation. There was a small squeak from the big beech tree near the right side of the front lawn. I heard it, but I wouldn't have thought anything about it if Agony hadn't appeared suddenly. He ran over to the bottom of the tree and started barking. I got up to investigate, and there was Siegfried up on a big limb with a half-grown bird in his mouth. His tail was switching back and forth as usual. "Your cat is up in this tree, Mr. Apple," I called. "He's just killed a bird." Uncle Al came over to stand beneath the tree. Mr. Apple came along too, but not very willingly. "These animals do cause trouble," Uncle Al said agreeably. "Mabel would blow a gasket if she saw that cat up there with that dead bird. I suggest we give both the dog and cat another chance before we ask that they be tied up." Mr. Apple got in his car and drove off, but I could see that he wasn't happy. He doesn't like Agony, and what happened this evening hasn't helped matters, and Agony doesn't like Mr. Apple. Aunt Mabel invited Midge to go to Princeton with us to see the fireworks. We left here a short while after dinner. It was still light, and naturally I should have seen Agony get in the car, but I was busy talking to Midge. Agony does his best to go along in the car whenever he can. Sometimes I think he is able to make himself invisible until the car is a mile or two from home. All right, he'll have to have a nice long wait in the car, Uncle Al said, and he'll probably be scared out of his wits by the fireworks if he has any. When we got to Palmer Stadium, there were hundreds of people there. We were directed to a big field by the stadium where there were row after row of cars. Uncle Al parked and we all got out. We had walked half of the way to the stadium before I noticed Agony trotting along beside me. "I've got to take this crazy dog back," I said. "I'll catch up with you." "Are you sure you can find the car in all this mess?" Uncle Al asked. "I think I'll take this sweater back too," Aunt Mabel said. "I'll go back with you. You two go on and get the tickets. We'll meet you at the gate." We threaded our way back through the cars until we came to a blue and white sedan. "Here it is," Aunt Mabel said. I opened the door and Agony hopped in the back seat. Aunt Mabel hooked her sweater over the rope on the back of the front seat and said, "I suppose it would be best to lock it. We wouldn't want to lose either the dog or my sweater." You can lock Uncle Al's car by pressing down the little buttons on the doors. Those on the front doors will pop up right up again if you close the door afterward. It's to keep you from locking the car with the keys inside. However, you can close the front doors, push down the buttons from the back, and then close the back doors. The buttons on the back doors don't pop up again. Aunt Mabel locked her side of the car that way, and I was about to do the same when I noticed the keys in the ignition. Uncle Al was always complaining about Aunt Mabel leaving her keys in the car, and I knew she would never let him forget having done it himself in a place like that. I didn't say a word. I simply reached over, took the keys out of the ignition, and stuck them in my pocket. The fireworks were wonderful, even though I didn't get to shoot off any myself. The American Legion puts on the show, and they did a good job. It doesn't start until it is dark enough for everything to show up well, so it was quite dark by the time it was all over. We took our time leaving the stadium because we knew there would be a terrible traffic jam in the field. Most of the cars had gone by the time we headed for our car, although they hadn't gone far. There were a lot of cars at the far end of the field and more in the street. We strolled along until we were about in the middle of the field, then Uncle Al looked around and said, "Well, where are we now?" We all saw two blue and white sedans at about the same time. Beside the one nearest the stadium stood Mr. and Mrs. Apple. "Well now, I wouldn't have thought that Apple was capable of such patriotism," Uncle Al said, "or childish enough to be interested in fireworks. I'm surprised." I wasn't surprised, because there had been more adults than children in the stands. I would have walked past without saying anything, but Aunt Mabel believes in being neighborly. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Apple," she said as we passed behind the car. Mr. Apple didn't reply. He looked at Uncle Al and said, "I'd like to know the meaning of this, Mr. Harris. That vicious hound of yours is in my car. He growls every time I get near the door." Uncle Al looked flabbergasted for a minute, and then he sighed. "I guess a mistake has been made," he said heavily. "Get Agony out of Mr. Apple's car, Hank." I wasn't certain what had happened as I walked over to the car. I tried the handle of the car, and, of course, it was locked. I forgot all about the keys in my pocket. Instead, I turned to Mr. Apple and said, "You'll have to unlock it." "I didn't lock it in the first place," he said peevishly, reaching in his pocket. His leaving his keys in the ignition must have been very unusual, because he was dumbfounded when he couldn't find them in his pocket. "I must have lost them," he said in a peculiar voice. "Agnes, look in your purse and see if you have your set." She didn't. And still I didn't think about the keys I had taken out of the ignition. I glanced inside the car and saw Aunt Mabel's sweater. Agony had knocked it down on the floor, but it was there. "I guess we'll have to get a garage man," Uncle Al said, "since we are at least partially responsible for this predicament. I'll go get someone." He started toward our car and then looked at the traffic-jammed street. "It'll be quicker if I walk to a telephone somewhere." "I'll see if one of those officers can suggest something," Apple said frostily. Uncle Al started back toward the stadium and Mr. Apple toward a parked police car. Mrs. Apple hesitated a minute and then decided she preferred her husband's company to ours. "Heavens, but I have caused a mess," Aunt Mabel said, putting her hands to her face. "I picked the car, so it's all my fault. Also, I suggested that we lock it." When she said that about locking the car, I remembered the keys. I pulled them out of my pocket and held them out. I know where the keys are, I said. I unlocked the car and Agony jumped out. I got Aunt Mabel's sweater and then I pulled up all the buttons so that none of the doors were locked. I stuck the keys back into the ignition. Aunt Mabel watched me thoughtfully. If you drove our car around to this side so that it would be the nearest to the stadium, no one would ever know what really happened, I said. That certainly isn't honest, but it seems like the most sensible way of settling this whole matter, Aunt Mabel said with a twinkle in her eye. We were all sitting in the car waiting when the apples returned. Uncle Al arrived at about the same time. It's all been a perfectly understandable mistake, Aunt Mabel said pleasantly. Mr. Apple thought our car was his. You see, I locked this when I brought my sweater back. Mr. Apple looked from our car to his, a short distance away. He appeared doubtful. Where are my keys? He demanded. If that is your car over there, Hank says they are in the ignition, Aunt Mabel said. Al is always scolding me for doing that, and I'm so relieved to know that I'm not the one who does. Mr. Apple walked off to look at the other car. He saw the keys in ignition, but still he looked uncertain. Mrs. Apple said something to him and he came back toward us. I guess you're right, he called. My apologies. Think nothing of it, Aunt Mabel said very sweetly. Uncle Al drove by the garage he had telephoned and told them not to bother. Then we started home. He was quiet most of the way. If I had had my wits about me, I would have noticed the license numbers, he said. There has to be some explanation of all this, or else you people are magicians. What I want to know is how you got this car unlocked if you locked it. I have the keys.